Power going in, energy coming out. At each end, there needs to be a connection to the grid.
It's a physical connection, either generating, creating electricity for the grid, or demand, taking energy from it. How important are these connections to achieving net zero goals? The simple answer is very important. Welcome back to the Clean Energy Revolution. I am Carolyn Cassan.
And I'm Laura Young, also known as Less Waste Laura.
One of the biggest challenges in achieving net zero is not the deployment of renewables or the cost, it's the complexity of connecting them to the grid.
In the UK, electricity capacity may need to double by 2030 to achieve net zero goals. Across the world, it's estimated we'll need 11,000 gigawatts by 2030 to triple renewable energy capacity. This goal of tripling renewable energy we've talked about on the show in March, so listen back to that one if you haven't already.
So, the bottom line, the importance of connections on either side of the grid, power going in, energy coming out, is significant. Today, we look at the challenges with grid connections and how they are being solved.
First up, we're having a bit of a problem in the UK, a problem with zombies. You're probably thinking, I don't remember seeing that on the news, but it's not what you think. We've got a problem with zombie projects. They're actually stalled projects that are waiting to be connected to transmission and distribution networks and are holding up others in the queue. Legacy regulations and policy has created challenges in connecting new renewables to the grid. So, how do we solve this? In order to achieve a decarbonised energy network in the UK, we only need an additional 75 gigawatts of clean generation added to National Grid's networks. Guess how much is backed up by these zombie projects, however, on the transmission network alone? It's 400 gigawatts. That's why National Grid, along with the entire energy industry, is committed to changing the connections process and delivering upgrades to remove the bottlenecks. I'm joined now by Ruth Shaw, Customer and Stakeholder Experience Manager in Electricity Transmission. Together, we'll look at the challenges here in the UK with grid connections, how generation and demand, so things that create electricity like wind or solar farms, and things that use factories, data centres for example, are being connected, and what reforms are needed to speed things up. Ruth, welcome. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, thank you. Thanks for having me, Laura. Looking forward to the chat.
Well, to begin our chat, I would love to take you back to 2020, because in 2020, you received about 250 applications for connections, whereas last year, 2023, it was about 1,200. What has been going on?
Yeah, it's interesting numbers, isn't it? And I think you refer to the 1,200 last year, and actually this year we're seeing it to continue to grow. So as you mentioned, it's kind of a dramatic increase from a few years ago. When we refer to connections, actually I want to be clear that there's kind of two different network types. When I think about our networks, I would always compare it to our road networks, is the easiest way to think about it. So our transmission networks are the high voltage networks transporting electricity across the country via direct routes, so very similar to our motorway networks. The distribution electricity networks are the lower voltage networks that take the electricity to its final destination, so to consumers and the local businesses, very much like A and B roads connected to the motorways. So motorways, transmission, A and B roads, distribution. And so where I work is the transmission part of the business, so the high voltage network. But I think it's important to understand both. And as you mentioned, Laura, we're seeing increased demand actually connect to both levels of the network, and it is really vast. So we're seeing a drive for connections, mainly due to a change in technology that we're seeing. So I think what's helpful context is the history of the grid. So what we've seen is that we're transitioning from a grid that originally was based around a small number of large fossil fuel power stations which were connected, now to being based around large numbers of renewable generators. And we're seeing that expansion of renewable technologies linked to net zero for varying different reasons, which then links to those high volumes of applications that you mentioned. But actually what's interesting is that the process around connections itself hasn't really shifted since kind of history began around the grid, if that makes sense. So it's kind of not really fit for purpose anymore.
I think it's exciting to hear that we are changing how we get our energy. So we are moving away from these huge fossil fuel projects and being able to innovate and create new ways of getting it. But as you've said, we have this huge volume of projects and the policy and practice maybe hasn't caught up with that. What are some of the other challenges, particularly as we face this volume of projects wanting to get connected to the grid?
Yeah, so I think as you already mentioned, there's a couple of different types of connections that we generally see, mainly around renewable generations wanting to connect to transmission and at distribution, to be fair, but also demand connections, including electrifying manufacturing, data centres, or EV charging points and heat pumps at distribution as other examples. And actually the challenge that we're really seeing at the transmission level is that complex set of interacting issues, which is kind of like the market, the policy, the existing process, and actually the appetite to support net zero. It's essentially creating an incentive for projects to secure a place in the pipeline, regardless of their viability. So that's driving a huge increase in applications that you've mentioned. And I guess when I say a pipeline, it's helpful to understand that today in transmission, what we have is a first come, first serve approach for connecting customers. So this means that we have to treat customers first come, first serve. We can't prioritise projects in different ways. So we're treating customers early, which obviously in its face value makes sense, but actually at the moment it's causing a lot of challenges. And what that means is the first come, first serve approach is actually having a knock-on effect to what are viable projects in the pipeline, due to the viable projects often being blocked by projects earlier on in the pipeline. And this is because of the volume of enabling works that are being created. So I just want to explain what I mean by enabling works for people that might not be aware. But our engineers review each application. So you mentioned that 1,200 earlier. Well, they will review each of those applications and plan for the pipeline in its entirety. So assessing each application and its impact on the existing network, and whether that means that it needs reinforcing or maybe extending to make sure that we're maintaining a safe and reliable network that, you know, we've all grown to know and love over the many years of its existence. But actually that's really, really important to how we plan our network. And so therefore what we're seeing is the volume of enabling works being triggered is far higher than what will ever be truly needed, because not all of those projects in the pipeline will truly progress to connect. So hence your reference to kind of zombie projects earlier. You know, those projects in the pipeline, not all of them will truly get to the point of connecting to our network. So that means that the process is no longer fit for purpose. And this is causing longer connection dates in the offers that we're actually giving to customers today, which is really challenging and obviously not meeting their needs. So this is why the wider industry is kind of focusing on reforms.
Thank you for that helpful context, because I think ultimately it's good to see a little bit behind the curtain of actually, one, what these zombie projects are, what their impact is on the grid, and what the likelihood is of those ever really getting connected. But it's positive to hear that there is actually an area where policy could change, and to hear that National Grid is working across the industry to really push forward to say, actually, here's some of the bottlenecks, here's how we could potentially move through those. But I was interested, you mentioned net zero. That is obviously a huge buzzword at the moment, but it's not just a buzzword, it's something that's really, really important when we think about the future in general. What role does connections to the grid have when it comes to us looking at net zero goals?
Yeah, so I think the role that connections has in net zero is really critical about supporting that renewable energy connecting to the grid. So as mentioned, in transmission, our focus is making sure that we're prioritising those viable projects to connect where we can, and ensuring we're supporting initiatives that will do that. So that will ultimately support net zero targets and aid customers to connect to the grid. You know, what's really important is basing connections to meet the demand of the future. So we need to be basing our future network on not only individual connections, but actually what's the demand requirements of our country as a whole. And this can't be solely based off individual projects. It needs to mean that we're thinking about how we plan and build our network to support net zero in its entirety, and fundamentally then driving value for end consumers. And, there's been loads of forecasting been done about what is actually required. You mentioned some figures earlier, and it's one of those that we're well above that today in the current pipeline. So it's ensuring that we prioritise to ensure that effort is put in the right place to support connections, but as I mentioned, the network as a whole. So, one of the challenges that we actually have today in transmission is that for people who maybe aren't as close to it, the barriers for entry, I guess, to have a connection aren't actually that high to submit and progress an application. So some of the proposals within industry are focusing on how future processes support having clear barriers for entry to ensure that there's the right commitment to develop certain projects. An example of this is kind of making sure that land requirements are supported up front. And we have examples today where there are multiple applications, but they might actually be all for the same piece of land. So you could have, say 3 applications that we all need to treat as viable, but only one of those will truly get to connect because it's on one piece of land. And that's just one example. And you've got that happening all over the network. So yeah, we really need to be basing our focus on connections to support the need of the country's demand requirements as a whole. And that will therefore support net zero. And as I mentioned, drive then value for end consumers.
Yeah, there's so many layers to this. It's not just as simple as pop up whatever energy project you want and within days you'll be connected and off you go. Actually, there's many, many steps and policies and procedures. And there's really good opportunities to streamline that. You've just mentioned so many things there. But I'm interested to maybe shift the focus a little bit to projects that have been created and have been connected, because I know that there is a huge amount happening at the moment. And if I am correct, it is that you have connected the biggest offshore wind farm in the world. Is that right?
Yeah, it's right. And it's, as you say, a really exciting connection. And I think, so the wind farm you refer to is known as Dogger Bank. So it's constructed in the North Sea, and actually it's being constructed in 3 phases. So we will refer to that as Dogger Bank A, B and C. And it's in 3 phases of 1.2 gigawatts. So actually when it will be fully complete in 2026, it'll be 3.6 gigawatts output, which will be enough to power 6 million homes with clean energy. So when you actually think of that scale, it's huge, which is really, really exciting. And as you say, even though I've mentioned the reforms are a huge focus for us, we also continue to make sure that we're continuing to connect really critical projects. And actually on the transmission network, we've connected over 90 power generators, including almost 30 gigawatts of zero carbon sources and interconnectors. And that's huge. So not only the world's largest offshore wind farm, Dogger Bank, along with that, we've also connected the UK's first transmission connected solar farm, which is known as Larks Green, to our Iron Acton substation near Bristol. And actually both Larks Green and Dogger Bank have all happened within the last 6 months. So, this is happening now. It's all really exciting stuff happening now that we're connecting, which is great. But obviously in the background, there's still policy changes which need to be happening to make sure that the process is fit for future connections, so that we continue to connect these really pivotal and important projects to support clean energy.
Wow. I mean, it's just exciting to hear about, this podcast is called The Clean Energy Revolution, and to hear these projects that are literally producing clean energy for millions of homes is just really showing the innovation and the technology that's moving forward. But absolutely, policy has a place in that as well. And you touched upon the fact that National Grid's working with the industry to try and highlight these issues and move forward. One of the words that comes up on every episode, I think, of this podcast is collaboration between different actors within the sector, different stakeholders, communities, policymakers. I guess I'm just wondering, could you touch a little bit on collaboration, particularly when you're thinking about the reform and the challenges when it comes to connections?
Yeah, definitely. And as you mentioned, collaboration is so key to this. We're engaging with the likes of government and wider industry, other network companies, the likes of the electricity system operator, the distribution networks on literally a daily basis. And it's such a joint effort in industry to drive a focus on this. And I think, there's something which people might or might not be aware of called the Connections Action Plan, which is actually a joint initiative by Ofgem and the UK government to improve the connections process for energy infrastructure. And its aim is all around, strengthening our obligations as network companies, but also delivering those more efficient connections for viable projects. And that's a piece of work that across industry we're all hugely engaged in and helping drive forward. And as you mentioned about the reforms, we're really closely working with the electricity system operator to ensure the new process that's being designed literally this year is going to help speed up connections and be fit for the future. And actually in the interim, there have been some measures that have already been underway, such as a connections amnesty. There's been new arrangements to manage the connections pipeline, along with optimising engineering works to accelerate connection dates for renewable projects, such as batteries. And we're also looking at how we can fast track connections for critical net zero projects, such as kind of large factories, making sure that we're prioritising where there will be economic value of the highest value. So alongside this and the connections process redesign, as you mentioned, we're engaged with lots of stakeholders, and some of those initiatives that I just mentioned and what we would call the more tactical reforms and aiming to accelerate viable projects have actually had the potential to accelerate over 70 gigawatts of connection dates. So that's really exciting. That's not a tiny, tiny number. So that will help with the accelerating of viable projects and removing stalled schemes. I think another part of this that is really, really important to National Grid is how we look at continuing to focus on our infrastructure, which fundamentally will help all of those connections. It needs to connect somewhere. And that's something that we call the Great Grid Upgrade, which will play a key role in accelerating connections. So we need to make sure that we have a network that allows renewable energy to power our country in years to come. So what we're doing as National Grid is investing in the largest overhaul of the grid in generations.
Yeah, I think it's so exciting to hear. I feel like I keep saying exciting on this episode, but to be honest, that is what it is, because we're hearing about these massive projects that are not only being created, but being connected. And of course, we are seeing simultaneously the Great Grid Update. Oh, I can't say it. It's a tongue twister. Great Grid Upgrade. I feel I just need to be patient. But it is really exciting to just hear about the different types of innovation, because partly we've taken it for granted for a while, which is we've had this amazing grid. You switch on your lights and you don't even think about it, or at least I don't think about it. I'm sure lots of people in your world think about it all the time. But actually, there's so much to happen. And so I guess for you, what are you excited about thinking about this world of connections and net zero and the Great Grid Upgrade?
From my perspective, as a consumer, you don't really know about any of the stuff that kind of is going on hugely unless you're really passionate about energy and renewable energy, where you might read things day to day and you could maybe take for granted that the ability to just turn on a light switch every day, it just happens. But there's a huge amount of work that goes on in the background. And I think what's really exciting is therefore the opportunity that comes with some of the figures that we've mentioned today and kind of the growth around net zero that is needed and the support around renewable energies, not only in National Grid, but the sector as a whole. And for me personally, I've only been in grid for the last 5 years and I don't come from an energy background, and it's been fascinating to work in the business for those years. And I think it brings huge opportunity for people who come from lots of different walks of life to come into our industry and therefore come at challenges and these things that maybe people go, whoa, that's a really big thing. Like, how are you going to tackle that? But bring innovative and different perspectives and different solutions that then help us get to a really positive end goal. Because, I think it's a really exciting time to be part of the energy industry.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Ruth, for coming and sharing that with us. I feel I'm taking away this analogy that the grid is like motorways and roads and just how it moves around, but also appreciating that connections don't just happen overnight, and there is a lot of planning and procedure, some of which National Grid and the industry are trying to change, trying to streamline. And so it's good to know that that work is happening, not just within National Grid, but actually within the industry, and to see the collaborations at the heart of it. But also, that exciting note to end on, both in terms of how much is being invested in the Great Grid upgrade, but also in connecting some of these absolutely humongous projects that are bringing that clean energy to homes, to millions of homes. And so, yeah, just really appreciate you telling us a bit more and clarifying what zombie projects are, because I think it's a funny term, but it's really good to understand just what that means and why we have so many of them. So thank you so much, Ruth, for coming onto the podcast. It's been so great to speak to you.
Thank you for having me.
I'm delighted to be joined by Sandy Grace, Vice President of U.S. Policy and Regulatory Strategy for National Grid. Sandy, welcome to the Clean Energy Revolution podcast.
Carolyn, thanks so much. It's so great to be here, and thanks for inviting me.
Such a pleasure. Really, really looking forward to our conversation. As we heard earlier in the show from Laura and Ruth, the current connections process in the UK needs development to support the country's net zero goals. Sandy, question for you. What's the situation in the United States? Are we seeing similar challenges?
Yes, absolutely. Carolyn, let me just take a step back and just tell you a little bit about National Grid's view with respect to getting the grid ready for significant changes that are going to emerge as a result of the work that's being done on the clean energy transition. The first and foremost thing I wanted to just note is that we really pushing to drive that energy transition at pace. And what that means is that we need to deliver a bigger, more flexible, and more customer-focused grid, and align and deliver on planning and permitting reforms and anticipatory investment to make sure that the grid is an enabler rather than a blocker for the change in how we choose to use energy going forward. So on balance, I think there is, a lot of work that is being done both at the federal and state levels to look at what we call interconnections in the US. I think in the UK, it's more commonly referred to as connections, but the idea is connecting resources, clean energy resources, to the grid at pace and in a way that's most affordable and reliable and beneficial for all of the customers involved.
That's fantastic. When you think about like the challenges, right? How do you address the challenges of connecting more clean energy to the grid?
Yeah, there are a couple of challenges. The first one is, and it's largely dependent on the size of the clean energy that's seeking to connect to the grid. So one of the most important things is for utilities to have visibility in terms of, the kinds of resources that are seeking to interconnect. So typically a process might look like a generator or a customer coming to the utility and saying, I want to interconnect a certain amount of generation to your system. And depending on the size of that, request, that the size and the scale of that request, the process could be, much quicker or it could be longer. And those are largely dependent on a couple of different factors. The first one is really, is there available grid capacity to date? So where a generator is seeking to interconnect, is there sufficient space on the electrical grid to interconnect that generator right away? If there is, then it's a much faster process. If there is not the available grid capacity, then the utility would have to build out, National Grid in this case would have to study what would be involved in interconnecting this generator and determine, how significant the upgrades would be needed to make that interconnection possible. And there are engineering studies that happen along the way to determine that. And then over time, depending on the scale and the size of the generation, build the upgrades necessary to accommodate that request. So, when we talk about challenges, I say it is part of it is just the saturation of the grid and, needing to understand where on the grid there's available capacity. And then the second piece is like the process associated with making sure that when you interconnect these generators, the grid has the necessary support in order to do so.
That was great to sort of hear about, specific to sort of what National Grid is doing. When you're thinking about reforms, and right, we're hearing so much about reforms that are necessary, reforms that are kind of on the table. So what kinds of reforms at both the federal and at the state level do you feel are required to facilitate more clean energy being put onto the grid?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me just talk about the reforms, and then I'll talk about what's happening at the federal and state levels. I think the first thing that is really important is that utilities can proactively invest and plan and invest in the grid ahead of the generation coming online, because that having that visibility and plan ahead is a much more efficient way to think about getting the grid ready for the interconnection of the resources. So if you recall, what I talked about earlier was really this dynamic where you have customer A saying, I want to interconnect here, customer B interconnecting here. So then you have a bunch of serial processes. Whereas if utilities are in a position to study, the volume of interconnections in a much holistic way and plan for it in an anticipatory manner, then that will streamline the time it takes to get these resources connected. And it's more cost effective because you're building it once. And that's way less disruptive for customers, and it's more affordable for customers as well. The second piece around the reform that I think is really important is with respect to interconnections overall. The reform that's happening, and it's in part driven by activity at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They issued an order at the end of last year looking at interconnection queue processes, is how organized markets, for example, study the kinds of resources that are seeking to, connect at a certain point. So they instead of doing more serial studies, doing cluster studies, for example. And the markets in which National Grid participates, which is the New York ISO and the ISO New England, they both have submitted compliance filings to FERC to look at interconnection reform for a larger scale generation interconnection. And in that regard, it's pending before FERC. But my point is, it's in process, it's happening. So that's at the federal level, really high level. At the state level, in Massachusetts, for example, there was a statute that was enacted a couple of years ago that set the basis for the electric distribution utilities to file what are called electric system modernization plans. And what that did, that statute, was it represented a sea change in the way utilities plan. So instead of the reactive planning where a customer says, please connect X, Y, and Z, this statute asks the utilities to say, okay, over the next 5 years, what do you need to do to prepare the grid for electrification in the transportation sector, or for change in, how we heat our homes? Like if you switch from gas heating to electric heating, like what would the change be associated with that, and what would be the grid upgrades required for that? And so National Grid filed our future grid plan earlier this year. It's currently pending before the Department of Public Utilities in Massachusetts. But what that filing represents is our vision and our plan for investments in the electric grid over the next 5 years to enable the electrification of heat and transportation and load growth that we anticipate will come as a result of increased needs for energy from data centers, from manufacturing, and from artificial intelligence. These are all going to be significant drivers for use of the electricity and the electric grid going forward.
Yeah, there's so much there. I find it absolutely fascinating. I think especially in the last I feel like the last year there's been this kind of emergence of like the data center and how much more pressure and demand it's putting on the grid, and how utilities and how are responding. So it's just such a kind of an array, a confluence of things that are happening everywhere all at once. It's I find it fascinating. Thank you so much for that explanation. How do you, like, when you think about how National Grid sort of advocates for policies to get the grid ready for renewables, what does that look like from your vantage point as, as someone who's so deeply involved in the policy and regulatory strategy for National Grid?
Yeah, I think it's really important to listen to stakeholders and get their perspective. So even before National Grid filed its electric system modernization plan, that plan and proposals that are included in the plan were reviewed and discussed through the Grid Mod Advisory Council, which is something that was established, and it's a number of stakeholders that are going to be impacted or interested in, how National Grid and the other electric utilities in Massachusetts might, respond to the statute through their filings. And that public consultation process is so critical because really, I think that we are looking at significant change in not only the way we use energy going forward, but our expectations around, the reliability and the resiliency of that energy delivery going forward. It needs to be there when we need it to be there. I think about my kids wanting to charge their iPhones and, and wanting to, have electricity on demand. And so I also think that not only is that stakeholder process important for hearing what stakeholders' perspectives are in terms of what their needs and wants are, but also to provide an education process for the utilities to talk about, from like inception to when you flip on a switch, you can heat your home and you can make sure your popsicles don't melt in the summer kind of thing. Like, what are all the things that happen before that point in time at which the customer turns on the power switch and, there's that electricity that's flowing through their line. So, personally, I think advocacy is about really listening, and it's also about education, and it's about public consultation. I also think, Karen, if I might just add, I think especially when we talk about reforms, as we did earlier, if you think about permitting and siting reforms, that's an area. So one of the things with respect to getting the grid built out is that, projects, depending on the size and scale, need to be permitted and sited. And there are efforts in Massachusetts, there's been discussion at the federal level about how can we more streamline these processes to make it open, transparent, inclusive, but not create, bottlenecks in the process. Because what we want to do is we want to have this process where stakeholders can be involved and understand why a project is going here in this particular community. And then we also want to do it in a way that's efficient so that, there are not these delays that are attributable to lack of coordination on the permitting and siting side to getting the grid ready for, the change in heating and in electrification overall.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, you really very much touch upon actually the next question that I had planned to ask you, specific to what you raised as collaboration, right, and the importance of collaboration, and that was also a theme that came out of Laura's conversation with Ruth earlier. Are there any targets that impact the connections process in New York, New England, and Massachusetts, right? You cover this region of the Northeast. Like, what are we thinking about here?
Yeah, I mean, I think both states have very ambitious climate goals and net zero goals by the middle part of this century, and so getting the grid ready for a change in energy usage and energy sources. So from to clean energy sources, it's going to require time. And there's a real impetus for the policymakers in the states as well as the federal levels to think about a couple of things, which is the reforms that we talked about already, like the planning reforms to identify the grid upgrades that are necessary, the permissions that are given in order for the utilities to invest in those grids on a proactive basis, and then the engagement with the stakeholders to explain what those upgrades are. And then once you have the planning and then you have the investment, then it's really about like the construction part. It's the how do you get a project built in the most efficient and cost-effective way. I will mention one other thing, which is it's tangential to the concept of interconnection queues, but it's overall with respect to how utilities plan for the grid. The planning protocols are obviously engineering driven because the utilities are required to maintain reliability standards. That's part of our public service obligation. The other dynamic around it is trying to identify engineering solutions that are the most cost effective. So in certain instances, utilities will evaluate traditional infrastructure, and they'll also evaluate what are called grid enhancing technologies. So we've partnered with Line Vision to look at line ratings as an opportunity to increase capacity on some of our transmission lines. And so that's an instance where utilities like National Grid will say, what are all the solutions that we have to address this particular need on the grid? And depending on that need, a grid enhancing technology may be something that would be appropriate. It may be much more expeditious to implement and much more cost effective to implement.
Thank you for that. Really appreciate it. So gonna kind of go into your portfolio. You've had such a vast array of, your expertise and your, the work that you've done over the years with National Grid. Could you highlight one project that you see as kind of leading the way and serving as a blueprint for how we should be approaching connections, and what would that project be?
Gosh, if I could talk about the electric system modernization plan, again, I will, because, having been involved in the company's development of that plan and the feedback that was received from the Grid Mod Advisory Council, seeing that public consultation process feed into, the filing that the company made, I think that obviously subject to what the Department of Public Utilities ultimately authorizes in terms of investments, I think that process-wise is a really important representation of both what we were talking about, the collaboration with the stakeholders on the front end, and then the proactive planning and investment that is the utilities plan to prepare the grid in anticipation for clean energy generation and resources to be connected over time.
So Sandy, earlier you talked about the upgrades and the investments that are happening in Massachusetts to the grid. Is there an analog in New York? Do we see, where do you see sort of those proactive investments? Where do you see them going?
Yes, absolutely, Carolyn. In New York, we've been a key stakeholder in helping to develop necessary grid upgrades and reforming the planning processes for large-scale renewables. And so, for example, we developed the engineering plans and the regulatory proposals for proactive grid upgrades to enable the 70% renewables by 2030. And this is what we've called the CLCPA Phase 1 and Phase 2 projects. And in doing so, we worked with stakeholders to define a statewide common planning framework, which is called the Coordinated Grid Planning Process, by which the utilities evaluate transmission facility needs for both renewables and customer load. And we use a recurring 2-year planning cycle that involves both the utilities and the organized markets to bring new investments to the regulator for approval. And then on the unregulated side of National Grid Ventures has developed proposals to bring renewable capacity to the load zones via transmission. So that would be competitive transmission that's being proposed by National Grid Ventures.
So I have a final question for you, and this is I know we both have children, and we've both kind of talked about our kids and how they kind of expect that whatever they have, they'll be able to charge it. They'll have immediate access to whatever they want to do when they want to do it. So when you think about like the grid that they're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years, or as they get older, like what is like I'm so curious if you like what your take is in terms of how our this younger generation, right? Like generation of our children, what's going to be different than what we see today?
Yeah, you know what I think is going to be so interesting to see in terms of technology evolution is bidirectional flows on the system. So if you think about electric vehicles and vehicle to grid charging, I have an electric vehicle that can really serve as a battery to support the grid. And so, whereas, in largely current state, you have the direction of travel for the flow of electrons to go one way. If you start seeing a lot of electric vehicles, you're seeing a lot of batteries that are possibly available to be deployed on the system. So when I think about what the grid of the future is, it's about a flexible grid that is bidirectional and then also uses all of these resources that are on the grid to help support the stability of the grid, but also to think about how you use these resources to moderate the amount of infrastructure that's needed. So can you aggregate or utilize these flexible resources like batteries, storage overall, or electric vehicles, vehicle to grid charging, vehicle to grid technology, and think about that as a way that utilities can say, hey, like which utilities are required to plan and build to peak demand. And so how can you use these flexible resources to shave that peak demand, which ultimately is a better outcome for customers overall? Because we talked about not only the cost of the energy transition and affordability being super, super critical to that dynamic, that, we need to make this transition affordable. And so if we are able to find cost-efficient ways to have a grid that meets the needs of customers, what's better than that?
That's what we're looking for, right? Excellent. Any final thoughts or comments that you'd like to share with our audience?
Yeah, I mean, there's just a lot here, Carolyn. I think that there is a lot of momentum to make sure that we can interconnect these resources as cost effectively, affordably and reliably as possible. But there's a lot of work to be done. So I think there's, a piece of this is where, we have a good sense of like what the reforms are that need to be made, but we need to put those reforms into action in order to get the outcomes that we're collectively looking for.
Well, thank you. And I really want to extend my thanks, gratitude to you and your team, because one of the things that I actually tell my children, as well as my students, is that, we are so fortunate, right, to have this kind of access to like electricity on demand, and we oftentimes take it for granted. And that's why I so enjoy having this conversation with you, is to be reminded, right, of all the work and all of the brain power that goes in, the engineering power that goes into sustaining, maintaining, but also sort of building out, as you so eloquently shared with us, like the grid of the future, the modernization that we're seeing to sort of meet new demands and to meet the clean energy needs and the net zero targets that that National Grid has set. So thank you for all your work, and thank you so much for joining us today. It's really been a great pleasure.
Yeah, it's always great chatting with you, Carolyn, and thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.
Hitting net zero targets will be impossible without a resilient, modern grid.
In the United States, upgrades are continuing to ensure energy security and clean energy for the Northeast.
In the UK, we're battling a zombie epidemic, but the good news is we're winning. Bottlenecks to renewable connections are easing, and more renewables are being added to the grid. For more information, you can visit nationalgrid.com.
And I hope you'll join us next month, where we'll be talking about innovations in clean tech.